Dzień dobry Państwu. Witam na Igrzysk.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Our today guest is somebody you know very well, so just formality. Professor Norman Davies, historian, writer, author of such books like The Gods Games, Europe, the 1944 Uprising, and recently an author of his own autobiography that was published just a year ago, and we can read it in Polish only. So far so good, but soon we will get it in English. The topic of today's meeting would be a question to be discussed: how to create Polish history, how Polish history is created. Professor, I'd like to be tricky. Is there anything like Polish history? Is it built specifically, differently than those of other nations, states? Well, good afternoon. In a sense, the history of Poland, like other national histories, are unique. But at the same time, it has its own course and certain similarities to other histories. That every man should know something about the history of their own nation, and about the history of other nations, mainly about the history of their neighbors. Do the Poles know the history of their neighbors? Some do, some don't. There are too many nations, states, civilizations to know about each and every one of them. You always need to make a choice. But we should say that history of your own nation evokes different emotions than the history of other nations. So you need to find a certain balance between your history and the history of others. Well, it's worth noting the word emotions you've mentioned. You are the author of two books that describe the entirety of Polish history. One is The Gods Game, Game to Play.
I druga, Serce Europy, krótsza, bardziej zwięzła, chyba 4 czy 5 lat
później. The second one, shorter, published some 4 or 5 years later, but these are two very different books. Do you believe there are different emotions in those two books? Obviously, and we often heard that the Heart of Europe is the abbreviated version of God's Playground. That is not true. The publishers recommended a shorter history, but they said that was impossible. God's Playground was written in a given moment in time, following certain style, and the Heart of Europe was written in Japan, almost without any source materials. Whatever sources were needed, they were in my head. And as far as I remember, that was a description of Polish traditions that are present today or then 30 years ago, but that are deeply rooted in the past. So that was a different landscape of the Polish history, and this emotional notion was different. Well, I don't know if you've ever heard the opinion that God's Playground is often named an academic publication, then The Heart of Europe, that I need to ask you about, is often considered a very personal book, a very sad one. Not like thinking over the history, but living the history. Well, it seems to me so. Let me just stress again, these are two different books written in different conditions and environment, different emotional environment. I need to get back to that. They have different tone. Just the second one supplements somehow what's missing in the first one. So, can you see any regularities in the creation of history and the private life of historians? You've just written your autobiography. Is your autobiography a Polish history? Of course it is not. That is a history of a single man, that is myself. But the book does include lots of information about history of Poland. I'm closely related to Poland. My wife is Polish. We speak Polish, mainly speak Polish at home. It would be impossible to write an autobiography without this Polish aspect. So let's move to that Polish element in your life. But where does this need to write about history come from? How did it all start in you? Oh, I can't remember that really. I believe that must have started during my studies in Oxford. I had exceptional professors, mentors, people who valued writings. But immediately after I graduated, I went for teaching. I was a teacher, in fact, at a school, and initially I didn't even teach history. I taught French. I believe that my history as my career came to the fore during my stay in Krakow in 1960s. I lived in Krakow then. I saw and learned Poland. Step by step, I managed to get command of this terrible language. And I could see I had something that hardly anyone in the West could have. I had access to historical sources, to the history of that country. So I returned from Krakow to Oxford after 3 years of continuous stay in Poland. I went to my mentor, Alan Taylor, and I asked him, could I make my PhD thesis? Would it be a good idea? I even started my doctoral studies in Krakow, and Taylor, a renowned historian and a writer, told me, PhD, it's for secondary grade people, just write a book. And that is how my first book was created, written, The White Eagle, the Red Star, before I got my PhD. Well, this Polish history, the history of Polish-Soviet War of 1920, was it of an interest in the UK? Because it was originally published in the UK for a long time, it was not available in Poland. Did you have any readers? Well, the book had its readers, certainly. It was sort of sensational at that time. It was instantly reviewed by the main military historian in England, Michael Howard, who recently died at the age of 100. And that review opened the topic like nothing before. And that book cast a new, unknown life to the Soviet issue, because the West didn't wish to believe that the Soviet Union attacked its neighbor in such a brutal way in 1920. Simultaneously, at the very time, the West believed that the Poles attacked the Soviets, not the other way around. And all of a sudden, on the front page of a renowned paper, a review of the book that presented the truth, the contrary version to that one that was popular. I know that later on, all military universities in the US used the book to exemplify the connection between war and politics. This book is not merely the history of a military conflict. It is a political and military history. Well, it did have a remarkable impact. Well, that book partially about history of Poland, but it's also about the history of international relations, the history of the Soviet Union, Europe. That book gave you an entry to work as a historian of Poland. From your autobiography, I read that you became the sole historian of Poland in the UK. How did you feel about that? How did you react to the fact that you were the only academic dealing with the history of Poland? Well, I think it's a bit of an exaggeration. I was not the only one, but indeed I was one of few. Among my fellow scientists, there were people who supported the Polish communist government. They had different visions of the history of Eastern Europe than I did. And my stance, my attitude was quite uncomfortable, but I managed to stick to my interpretation, and I believe I did quite a good job to open the public eyes and the real life in the East. The Poles will not understand that, but during the Second World War, the Soviet Union was our ally. To some extent, Stalin saved our lives. The UK was in a very bad condition in 1940-41. The US gradually started to help, but the greatest battles of that war, whether we like it or not, were in the East. And the victory of the Red Army saved us. And the emotional relation to the Soviet Russia was absolutely different than the countries where the Red Army arrived and introduced the Eastern Order. So, as a historian, I had to change the stereotypes. That was really needed. Obviously, I was not alone, but I had this particular function and the jungle of historic writings. And the jungle, was it a duel between you and those that thought like yourself, like Antony Poloński, Robert Conquest, perhaps, who fought for the emotional perception of their books with the historians that are known as Soviet specialists. Of course, but it was not I wasn't as important as Conquest. Robert Conquest was a great person. He was 20 years older than myself. In the 1950s and 60s, he was alone to write the first works on the history of the Soviet Union, about the terror, about gulags, all those dark sides of the Soviet Union. I, a young historian, sort of joined his stream. Poloński, who was more or less of my age, did similar things. He wrote about the history of Jews in Poland and elsewhere. And that was a topic that was hardly known to the public. And Anthony received criticism from both sides, just like myself. This is just the risk you need to face. He's still alive. I'm still alive. We went through that. And such intellectual conflict was necessary to slowly change the stance, the approach. That was the more difficult conflict, because not only did you object to your fellows, but also to your masters, like Taylor.
Yeah. Taylor was leftist, politics-wise. Never was he a communist. He was very brave at different times of history. He stood against Soviets. However, he didn't share my opinions. On the other hand, never did he want to convert me. I had a good rapport with him. He lived a long life. However, there were moments when my wife, who is Polish, was talking to his wife. Madame Taylor couldn't believe that Stalin was a perpetrator. There were difficult and harsh moments. However, Taylor was an outstanding speaker. He was ready to discuss things. Never did he give up on a dialogue. He was a true master of dialogue. Yes, he was a true master who taught you the art of dialogue. But my question refers to yet another aspect of history of a country. For many years, you were dealing with Poland's history, and then you seamlessly switched to history of Europe in general. Was it of help to write a national history, or was it a different challenge? Yes, it was a different challenge. But you need to have a start for your journey and expand your horizons of thinking. Luckily enough, my intellectual beginnings are rooted in France and Italy. I was a teacher of French, as I said. I was working at school for 5 years. Never ever since then have I had a narrow specialization of one country. I chose Poland for the beginning, but I was more of a writer at that time. I do remember that day in Oxford, the big publishing house at the university was looking for a historian to write a book. That was Gorbachev's times. The editor-in-chief, the editor, was convinced that future Oxford history would have to focus on Eastern Europe and Western Europe at the same time. You cannot write it as you used to write before. So they were prospering for writers amongst big professors, great professors. They were looking for somebody who was able to write about the East and the West, and CEE too. They did not find anyone. No great Oxford historian was able to have an inclusive vision of Europe in their book. So I was the author of History of Poland, published by Oxford, so the God's Playground. So the editor requested, do you know anything about Western Europe, was the question. Of course, that was an obvious thing for me. Therefore, I was commissioned to write the history of whole Europe. I was requested by Oxford University Press. It took me 9 years. I was trying to find a place to include history of all regions and all the states. to bring it together and to make a very nice broth out of that. And you made it. Europe's history. You mentioned the title of the book in Polish at the beginning of our conversation. This book was published by Folio Society, an exclusive version. This is the publishing house that releases classical types of books on history and arts. It's been 25 years since the first release. It's a great success. As you said, this nice broth is something we can describe many of your books. There is some other broth that is typically Polish. The book that was first published in Poland. This is most Polish book of yours, though Poland is not the only theme of the vanished kingdom. Vanished Kingdoms is a book composed of 17 or 18 chapters, as I remember, each of which relates to a country or a state that used to exist, used to flourish, but no longer exists. So every state, every nation, just like every person, starts to live, comes into being, and then reaches the end of the life cycle. This concept was very much needed. People often think that Europe's map is something that does not change. It has been curved in stone. But all of a sudden, we discover that not even one state that used to exist 500 years ago no longer exists today. The map keeps changing. The context keeps changing. Countries and states come into being and perish. New ones mark their presence on the map. History is written from the point of view of a state that is still alive. For example, the German Empire at the end of the 19th century comes into being. This is a giant, and everybody wants to know the history of the state, the beginnings, the origin of this country. Or now, superpower, namely China, every university in the world has its own section focused on history of China, something that we did not have at Oxford 50 years ago. Now there's a whole array of people dealing with Chinese history. So what I'm doing here is returning to the perspective of old times. The world was different, like in the 16th century. Spain was the world's greatest country, a great empire that no longer exists today. In the East, the Republic of Poland, Poland and Lithuania, Europe's greatest state of that time, until the times when Muscovites crossed the Ural. Before that, the First Republic of Poland was greater than Russia. Now people think that Poland is a little country. Talk to Estonians. Even today, they find Poland a huge state, the state of great importance. I delve into studying these countries that no longer exist. It starts with the Kingdom of Wales in the 5th or 6th century, the place where today Scotland is, and we finish with the Soviet Union. Soviet Union, which no longer exists. Only recently has it perished. A few dozen years ago, it was the biggest state on the globe's map. It did exist, and overnight, in 1991, it vanished into thin air, no longer exists. People did not realize these facts. It's not opinions. These are facts and figures. And this is very Polish topic. There is no better example for this truth than what used to be the First Republic of Poland, that used to be a vast and extensive country that marked its place on the map of Europe. After the partitions, it vanished. What was created 123 years after was a completely different Poland. It was not the same. In your books and in what you are saying now, you devote a lot of space to perspective. We've been sitting at homes since March. Some of people started staying at home even earlier. But your books, your works, your thinking about history has got this traveler's gene. You've traveled a lot. Does it help to write books on history? Yes, indeed. I do like to become familiar with the cities and the countries that I write about. It gives you a different emotional attachment to the topic. When writing about Poland, I visited Poland on numerous occasions, but never before have I visited Lviv or Vilnius. After the first book, the Russian consulate did not give me the visa. Never was I able to see Poland's eastern outskirts. The moment I got a visa to visit Soviet Union, it was October 1991, so 1.5 months before the state died, I instantaneously flew to Moscow, and from Moscow to Lviv. Lithuania was sealed off at that time for visitors from Moscow. It declared independence well before the Soviet Union perished to exist. I did see Soviet Lviv. These were the last days. It was a very important moment to see the monument of Lenin sharing the fate of Saddam Hussein's monument in Baghdad. That was the onset for my thinking to work on the kingdoms that vanished because a great state was dying in front of my eyes. I don't want to make a direct connection, but the Soviet Union did know exactly what they were doing, not releasing the visa for him. Well, I hope so. I was facing different troubles. I had my English colleagues who used to go to Moscow all the time. It was difficult to argue with them because they used to say, I was talking to Brezhnev in person. You don't know that, but they believed this to be the source of truth. My colleagues were pretty self-confident. They had their own theories. I was excluded from that country. I was not allowed to visit. I was not respected at that time. One of Poland's Soviet histories or stories were written in one of your books, The Trail of Hopes. That is a traveler's book, kind of. Yes, I came into knowing this quite early, was still in Great Britain. The Foreign Books Department director in Oxford, Mr. Kazimierz Mareński, was the one that traveled half the world.
Bardzo wcześnie, właśnie zanim w ogóle pojechałem.
He had strong associations with Andel's army. I had heard it before I went to Poland. 50 years after, there was that moment that I was able to visit the countries like Iran, Russia, Palestine, Italy. And I decided to give a description of Anders' army's trail based on my knowledge of the actual areas. I'm pretty happy with this album, as I call it, because there are more photos than text. I get letters every day from Andel's army members, children, grandchildren, and young ladies, many young ladies who've never heard about grandparents' histories because a grandfather did not want to discuss what they experienced during war. But now these young people want to know, want to go to these places, want to learn more, want to prosper for information, find the graves of those people. Sometimes we don't think about it. Poles write a lot about Monte Cassino, but they don't know that more Andel soldiers died in Uzbekistan compared to the number of victims in Italy. They died of different illnesses. I do respect young people who want to learn more about grandfathers' experiences, or even whole families. We do hope that pandemics will come to an end sooner or later. Or you said traveling. So what are your plans? Are you writing another history of Poland? I'm writing a history of Galicia. It's not a history of Poland, because Galicia was a multinational province of the Austrian Empire. So the memory of Galicia is fragmented. Poles describe Galicia as if it was truly Polish. There's a Krakow museum, which is a museum of Jews, as a matter of fact. In Lviv, they have their own presentation of history, that is Ukrainians' history. They call it Halicina, believing that Eastern Galicia was different from the Western Galicia. Nothing further from the truth. It was a multi-language, multi-ethnic, multinational melting pot. Each of the nations, each of the cultures had their own place there. And we need to cook a new broth that brings together different elements. We cannot write separately about each nation. I'd like to express my gratitude for this meeting because we are nearing the end. All of you are invited to taste one more broth, the autobiography that was released only last year. It was 80th birthday of Professor. If you're interested in what we've been discussed today, this all and much more can be found in the book. I'd like to thank for today's meeting. Can I have a brief comment?
Studiach Polski za granicą. Wiedza o Polsce.
Studying Poland in foreign universities is what I deal with. It's appalling that people know little about Poland. I'm not speaking about Polish studies in the sense of a language and literature, but history studies in the US, in UK, to have this Polish element. Economy, to have some kind of Polish traits. Sociology, to find some elements. So this is why the foundation designed to advertise this kind of line of studies in the months to come. Thank you very much. This initiative should be praised. Znak Publishing House will join the efforts, I can promise, should you be interested in this aspect of Professor's activity. It didn't start today or yesterday. You can find it in the biography of Professor. We'll try to support you. Thank you very much. Hope to see you soon.